Okay, so today I wanted to talk about value studies. And the idea behind a value study is that we are really creating a tonal design for a picture. And we're doing that in a very simplified way. We're trying to create a strong impact. We want something that is relatively simple, but still has a very strong sense of design. The In most cases, the lighting is going to really define the areas of light and dark. So the light's going to add drama to the picture, and it could be doesn't have to be dramatic. You could use a soft light as well. But the idea is that we are designing the picture with values. And there's a little bit more to it than that. So I like to kind of break it down into three categories when I'm, doing a tonal study for a drawing or a painting. I want to create something that does have interesting shapes. So shapes is kind of the first thing I start thinking about. And then the next thing is to designate a specific value to each shape. And value simply is the degree of lightness or darkness, which most of you have heard me say before. So very important. That will help to define how dark the shadows are and how light the lights are. And then the third thing is the edges, which are very important too. So and it kind of goes in this order. So I sort of break down this order. And let's start with something very simple. So I'm going to show a lot of examples today of different paintings and photographs, and I'll talk about them a little bit, and I'll show you how I would create value studies using those images. I wanted to kind of take a look at this example of Vermeer. Vermeer was really a master of values. If you look at any of his paintings, there's a very, very strong sense of tonal design in the paintings, and the colors are very subtle most of the time. He does kind of hit you with some strong colors here and there, but for the most part, if we look at the flesh tones, if we look at the cloak, he's a very tonal painter. So the first thing we can do when we're taking a look at something like this, and I will actually copy this, but even before I do that, let me just kind of go with a little bit of a simpler form. So let's start with the form of a sphere. Okay, so we can start that off with just a circle. I'm going to grab my neutron circle to start with because it's a little bit easier to work with. Okay, and a simple sphere, we have just a circle, and then we would have a light source that would illuminate a portion of this circle, and then the other portion would be falling into shadow. So I'm going to stick with a very similar light to what we have here, which is a classic three-quarter lighting. The light's coming at an angle like that, hitting a portion of the front of the face. And also, we're seeing quite a bit of shadow. So I'm just going to draw a line in, which is going to separate my light and my shadow. On a sphere, it's very simple. We just have one curve. Obviously, it's more complex here, but we can sort of take this idea and apply it to the sphere. So when we're looking at the light, the first thing we want to do is, kind of attribute a specific value to our lights. And I'm really just going to break this down into three tones. So I'm going to use two tones for my lights, essentially my general light and then my highlights. And then I'm going to use one tone for my shadows. I may sneak a fourth tone in there for my halftones, but I'm just going to start with really just the three. So, when I'm looking at the light, I'm working on gray paper. So I'm going to use my white pencil. And if I look at the flesh tones here, they're actually very close to a mid-tone. The other thing that can be very helpful is a value finder. So you can pick these up at Jerry's Artorama, and I can use this to kind of decipher what value her flesh tone is. So if I just slide that around a little bit, I can kind of pick out an area, such as the cheek here. And I squint a lot. If I squint, when I look at that, I can see that the flesh color there, or the value of the flesh, I should say, kind of blends with this gray. Okay, so that's my number 5 gray, which is basically a mid-tone. And that's very close to my paper tone, which is also close to a mid-tone. Yeah, value 5 seems to be about right. So then I would take my white pencil here and I would add another tone for my highlights. Okay, so if I'm looking at highlights, I'm thinking about forehead, front plane of nose. I'm ignoring the eyes for now. Those are obviously a little bit lighter. I'm going to ignore those. And I'm just going to kind of softly apply some of this light, which moves right through from top to bottom here. And if I'm really breaking these down into specific shapes, I could be a little bit more precise and just say that my light shape is doing something like this. Okay, so shapes is one of the first things. So we have a shape for the light. And then through here, this becomes another shape, which is my general light. And then I would have shape for my shadow. Now I'm designating values to each one of these shapes. So my shadow, I'm going to push quite a bit darker, and I could come back to my value finder here, and I can see that that's really close. That's basically the black on my value scale. You can make your own value scales as well. So I used to have one that I had made where I had just shaded out a series of squares. And then you can just cut little shapes into them, such as you see here, to match that to your picture. But let me see here. So if I'm going with a value number 5, I'm going to go quite a bit darker than this. Now, this is a very dramatic light. So we have a strong range between our lights and darks. And that's not always the case. I'm going to show you quite a few paintings where that does not happen, where the lights, you may have very little range between the lights and the shadows. But in this case, this lighting is very dramatic. So this is really the value range that Vermeer was using, pretty much a full value range. So I've kind of gone through steps 1 and 2 already. I have my shapes, I mapped those out, and then I'm designating a specific value to each shape. And so the next step is then to start looking at edges. And when we think about what edges are, they're really a result of the light. They're most of the time, it has to do with the turning of a plane. So we're moving from general light right here into shadow, but that doesn't happen immediately. There's a gradual turn there. So that's going to create what I refer to as the halftone. And if we, take an example, if we were to think of this more as a plane, you have let's say the light's coming from above and hitting my square from above. So that would be directly facing the light. And then let's say I had another square that was turned completely vertical, that would be facing the shadow. So let's say this is my really dark shadow, similar to what I have there. Okay, so I'm just going to tone that down to a black. So then what happens in here is we might have a plane that is at a little bit of a tilt. Okay, so that's going to be slightly darker than my light, but not as dark as my shadow. And essentially that would be my halftone, which in this case is going to be just a tad darker than the tone of the paper. Okay, so that would be a situation where, you know, the plane is determining the transition. Now, if I look at that on a round form, there's many of those subtle variations within just a very narrow space. So if I'm thinking of halftone, it might be about this much area that becomes halftone. And, you know, on this reproduction, I could even go ahead and start to draw in the borders between some of these shapes. So from here to here, this is darker than what's happening in here, the area of my general light. Okay, so what I would do then is just go ahead and apply a tone to that. And this applies to drawing as well as painting. Really, really important. Edges can do so much for a picture. They can describe form, but also space. Things that are further off in space get softer. The edges get softer. They become more out of focus. So there's really a lot that we can do with edges. And then if I was making this a more realistic drawing, I would eventually start to, you know, blend this some more. I would soften this value into my halftone, the shadow value into my halftone, and the halftone into my general light, and so on. But I really, you know, was able to kind of more or less map out all of my values, just really thinking about my shapes. And, you know, I did it pretty simply. I used 4 values. I ended up adding a 4th value, but most of the information that I put into this picture was done with 3 values. And this would just get a little softer through here. By the time I get to the edges, this is where I spend most of my time just blending, softening, and also defining things. So if I go a little too soft, I can come back and harden the edge again or sharpen it. But this information is already starting to represent a 3-dimensional volume in space. We get the sense that this is a round form, a sphere-like form. And we can apply the same technique to something like the Vermeer painting here. I can add those tones. I just have a little bit more complexity now because I have features